So today I want to talk about something that happened at the United Nations on April 7th that I think most people completely misunderstood. And I mean completely. Because when China and Russia vetoed the UN Security Council resolution on the Strait of Hormuz, the Western media said, okay, China and Russia sided with Iran. China and Russia are bad guys. China and Russia are shielding a regime that is threatening the global economy. But that is the wrong way to look at this. That is completely the wrong frame. Because here is my question, and I want you to sit with this question for a moment before I answer it. If China vetoed this resolution, and China is the world's largest buyer of Iranian oil, and China gets a huge portion of its energy through the Strait of Hormuz, then why would China veto a resolution that would reopen the strait? Why would the biggest victim of the Hormuz blockade be the one blocking the solution? Think about that. Because once you understand the answer to that question, you understand not just the veto, you understand the entire war. You understand who is really winning, and you understand why China's veto was not a mistake. It was the single smartest strategic move of this entire conflict. Okay, so let me break this down carefully. Let's start from the beginning. On April 7th, 2026, the United Nations Security Council voted on a resolution that was originally proposed by Bahrain. The resolution would have authorized countries to use, and I'm quoting directly, all necessary means to ensure freedom of transit through the Strait of Hormuz. 11 countries voted yes. China and Russia vetoed it. Pakistan and Colombia abstained. Now, I want to walk you through what actually happened in that room because the details are very important. The original resolution was very aggressive. It would have given any country the legal cover to use military force to reopen the strait. Russia, China, and France all said, no, this is too extreme. We cannot authorize the use of force. So they revised it. They took out all references to offensive military action, and still China and Russia vetoed it. Then they revised it again. They took out any reference to Security Council authorization entirely, and still China and Russia vetoed it. So they kept weakening the resolution. They kept making it softer. They kept taking out the aggressive language, and China and Russia still said no every single time. Now, the American ambassador said China and Russia sided with a regime that seeks to intimidate the Gulf into submission. The UK ambassador said China and Russia chose to shield their ally, Iran. That is the Western narrative. China and Russia are protecting Iran. But I want you to really think about this. Is that what happened, or is something much more sophisticated going on? Okay. So here is my framework for understanding this. And this goes back to something I have discussed many times on this channel, which is the idea that in geopolitics, you should never look at what a country says. You should always look at what a country does. And more importantly, you should always ask, what does this action actually benefit? So let's apply this framework to China. China imports approximately 10 to 11 million barrels of oil per day. A significant portion of that comes from the Gulf region and passes through the Strait of Hormuz. So in theory, China should want the strait open. In theory, China is being hurt by the closure of the strait, right? Well, here is the thing. Yes, China is being hurt in the short term, but China is not making decisions based on the short term. China is making decisions based on the long term. And in the long term, this veto is one of the most strategically brilliant things China has done in a generation. Let me explain why. And I want to walk through this step by step because each step builds on the last. Step 1, understand what the resolution would actually have done. The resolution, even in its watered down final form, would have given the United States and its allies the legal legitimacy to use military force in or around the Strait of Hormuz. It would have been the United Nations saying, yes, America, you have the right to be here, you have the right to control this waterway, and here is what that means for China. If America successfully reopens the Strait of Hormuz by force and Iran is defeated or forced to back down, then America has demonstrated something extremely important. It has demonstrated that it can still control the world's most critical energy choke point. It has shown that the American empire, even in decline, still has the muscle to decide who gets energy and who doesn't. And that means China goes back to being dependent on American goodwill for its energy supply. China goes back to a world where America can at any moment threaten to cut off Chinese oil supply by controlling the strait. This is called the Mallah dilemma in Chinese strategic thinking. China's fear that America can strangle its economy by controlling the sea lanes. Hormuz is the same problem. It is a choke point that America, if it controls, it can use against China. So step one is simple. If America wins this resolution and uses it to reopen the strait by force, America wins strategically and China loses, which means China has every reason to block the resolution. Step two, understand what happens if the strait stays closed. Now, here is where it gets really interesting because the closure of the strait is hurting China. Yes, but it is also accelerating something that China has been working toward for decades, which is the de-dollarization of global trade, the weakening of the Petrodollar System, and the rise of alternative trade routes that China controls. Let me explain the Petrodollar System first, because it is the key to understanding everything. Since 1973, all oil in the world has been traded in US dollars. This was a deal between America and Saudi Arabia. The Saudis sell oil only in dollars. America protects the Saudi regime because everyone in the world needs oil. Everyone in the world needs dollars. This creates permanent global demand for the US dollar. It is what allows America to print money, run enormous deficits, and finance its military empire. Without the petrodollar, America cannot afford to be America. Now, what happens when the Strait of Hormuz is closed? Gulf states cannot export oil. Petrodollars stop flowing. The Gulf states stop recycling dollars back into American stock markets and American AI data centers. The entire financial architecture of American power starts to crack. And China is watching this happen. And China is thinking this is actually good for us. Because every week that the petrodollar system is under stress, the world is being pushed to find alternatives. And the alternatives that exist, the yuan-based oil trade, the Belt and Road payment systems, the Russian, Iranian, Chinese energy corridors, these all benefit China. So the closure of the strait in the medium term is accelerating the very thing China wants most, which is the end of dollar dominance in global trade. Step three, understand China's alternative energy strategy. Now, you might say, okay, but China is running out of oil because of the blockade. How is this actually good for China? And this is where you have to understand something important about how China thinks about supply chains. China has been preparing for exactly this kind of energy disruption for years. Let me give you some specific examples. China has been building strategic petroleum reserves. It has been diversifying its energy suppliers. It has been building the China-Pakistan economic corridor, which gives it access to ports in the Arabian Sea that bypass the Strait of Hormuz. It has been developing the north-south transport corridor with Russia and Iran, which gives it an overland energy route. And most importantly, China has been rapidly building domestic renewable energy capacity, solar, wind, nuclear, specifically to reduce its dependence on Gulf oil. So while the blockade is causing short-term pain for China, China is actually better positioned to absorb that pain than almost any other major economy because China has been preparing for this scenario. The Americans have not absorbed the shock in the same way. The Europeans have not either. Japan and South Korea, both deeply dependent on Gulf energy flows, have not built comparable resilient structures at the same scale or speed. Yet China has taken the short-term economic pain associated with disruption in the Strait of Hormuz. And more importantly, it is the country best positioned to absorb that pain over time. This is not because China is immune to disruption, but because it has spent years constructing strategic buffers against precisely this kind of shock. What matters in this context is not simply who suffers, but who adapts fastest, and more critically, who uses the crisis as a mechanism for structural repositioning. Every additional week that the crisis persists does not produce a uniform set of consequences across all actors. Instead, it accelerates divergence. The alternatives, China has been building energy diversification strategies, strategic petroleum reserves, overland transport corridors, and non-dollar trade mechanisms become progressively more relevant under conditions of disruption. Meanwhile, the traditional maritime architecture that has long been dominated by the United States does not collapse, but it gradually loses marginal utility as alternative systems begin to carry more of the global load. In this sense, crisis does not simply redistribute pressure. It reshapes relevance. To understand China and Russia's veto at the United Nations Security Council, however, one must also move beyond the economic dimension and into the legal and moral framework that was being contested. According to statements made in the Council, Russian and Chinese representatives argued that the resolution failed to address what they described as the root causes of the conflict. Russia's position emphasized that the draft resolution placed disproportionate responsibility on Iran while ignoring preceding military actions carried out by external powers. China similarly expressed concern that the resolution framed Iran as the primary destabilizing actor without adequately acknowledging the broader sequence of escalation that led to the crisis. From this perspective, the core argument is not simply geopolitical, but procedural and normative. The question being raised is whether international law is being applied consistently or whether it is being used selectively to legitimize pre-existing military actions. Critics of the resolution argue that if a state initiates military strikes against another sovereign country targeting infrastructure, nuclear facilities, or leadership structures, and that country subsequently responds by asserting control over its own strategic waterways, then attempting to retroactively secure international authorization to use force against the second state raises fundamental questions about legal symmetry and moral consistency. This is where the broader global reaction becomes significant. Many states outside the traditional Western alliance system, particularly across Asia, Africa, and Latin America, have long been sensitive to patterns in which international institutions appear to endorse interventions that originate from major powers, while framing the subsequent reactions of targeted states as illegitimate. From this standpoint, China's veto is interpreted by some not merely as alignment with Iran, but as resistance to what is perceived as the selective application of international legal norms. In this reading, The veto functions as a statement that authorization for the use of force cannot be granted in a way that retrospectively legitimizes escalation initiated by one party, while delegitimizing the defensive or reciprocal actions of another. As a result, the political signaling effect of the veto extends beyond the immediate conflict. It positions China as a state asserting procedural consistency within the framework of international law, while simultaneously challenging the perception that global governance institutions operate as extensions of a single dominant power's strategic preferences. This interpretive shift is crucial because it reframes the veto not simply as obstruction, but as an attempt to contest the moral framing of the conflict itself. When placed in a broader historical context, this moment reflects a deeper structural transition in the international system. For decades following the end of the Cold War, the United States operated within a global order in which it possessed exceptional latitude to shape outcomes through a combination of military capability, financial influence, and institutional leadership. In many cases, Security Council dynamics did not meaningfully constrain American strategic preferences due to the relative alignment or weakness of other major powers. However, the significance of the Hormuz-related veto lies in what it signals about the erosion of that unipolar moment. The United Nations Security Council is one of the last remaining formal institutions in which global powers can directly veto one another's strategic preferences at the highest level. When China and Russia exercised that veto in response to a resolution supported by Western states, it demonstrates that the institutional architecture of global governance is no longer capable of functioning as a unilateral extension of any single power's strategic agenda. Instead, it increasingly reflects a condition of structural contestation. This shift marks an important transition from unipolarity toward a more multipolar configuration of global power. In such a system, no single state is consistently able to translate military capability, economic influence, or diplomatic coordination into automatic institutional compliance. Instead, outcomes are increasingly determined by negotiation, obstruction, and countervailing veto power. The Hormuz veto, in this sense, is not an isolated procedural event, but part of a broader pattern in which major powers actively use institutional mechanisms to constrain one another's strategic initiatives. To understand the strategic significance of this moment, it is useful to step back and consider how modern geopolitical competition operates across multiple dimensions simultaneously. Military power is only one layer. Economic resilience, financial architecture, institutional legitimacy, and narrative framing all operate as interconnected theaters of competition. From this perspective, China's veto can be interpreted as a multidimensional strategic action that carries implications across all four domains. Militarily, China does not engage directly in the conflict and does not incur the costs associated with force projection. However, by blocking authorization for intervention, it alters the legal and diplomatic environment in which military action might occur. Economically, while disruption in energy flows imposes short-term costs, it simultaneously increases pressure on existing financial systems and accelerates incentives for diversification away from dollar-centric trade mechanisms. Politically, the veto reinforces China's positioning as a state, advocating sovereignty and non-intervention, a message that resonates strongly with much of the global South, where historical experience with external intervention remains a defining factor in international perception. Narratively, it allows China to present itself not as an aggressor, but as a counterweight to perceived unilateralism, reinforcing a broader story about balance, sovereignty, and institutional fairness. What makes this strategy significant from a systems perspective is not any single dimension in isolation, but the convergence of effects across all four. A move that is neutral or even costly in one domain can become strategically advantageous when it generates reinforcing benefits in others. In that sense, the veto functions less as an isolated decision and more as part of a broader structural positioning strategy. At the same time, it is important to acknowledge the counter-argument. China is not insulated from energy disruption, and sustained instability in key maritime routes carries real economic costs. No major economy is capable of indefinitely absorbing significant interruptions in energy supply without consequences. However, the more relevant strategic question is not absolute resilience, but relative endurance. Different actors in the system possess different thresholds of political tolerance, economic flexibility, and institutional stability. From this perspective, the competition becomes a question of temporal endurance. Which actors can sustain pressure longer without internal fragmentation or external constraint? The United States faces political limits shaped by domestic opinion, economic sensitivity to energy prices, and alliance management pressures. Iran, despite external pressure, has developed adaptive mechanisms over decades of sanctions and is not operating from a position of immediate systemic vulnerability. China, meanwhile, has invested heavily in redundancy, reserves, and alternative infrastructure precisely to increase its capacity to withstand disruption while maintaining strategic optionality. The significance of this asymmetry is that time itself becomes a strategic variable. If one side is more sensitive to prolonged disruption than another, then extending the duration of a crisis can become a form of indirect leverage. In this sense, the veto is not merely a reaction to a specific resolution, but part of a broader contest over how long structural pressure can be sustained and who ultimately bears the greater cumulative cost. Ultimately, what emerges from this analysis is not a simple narrative of winners and losers, but a more complex picture of systemic transition. The global order is not collapsing in a sudden rupture, but is instead undergoing a gradual reconfiguration in which institutions, financial systems, and strategic corridors are being contested, duplicated, and partially replaced. The veto at the United Nations is one expression of this transition, revealing how even procedural decisions within international institutions can reflect deeper shifts in the distribution of global power. In this context, the most important takeaway is not any single prediction about immediate outcomes, but the recognition that the system itself is entering a phase of structural competition in which legal, economic, and strategic instruments are increasingly intertwined. Understanding this requires moving beyond event-based analysis and toward a framework that treats geopolitics as a layered system of interdependent pressures evolving over time. This is not prophecy. It is structural interpretation combined with strategic reasoning. And the purpose is not to prescribe conclusions, but to provide a framework through which the logic of the system can be more clearly understood